alum, then bringing in tons of coal from Newcastle and barrels of urine from London. In some places, there were even switch points where different tracks joined together. But how did they get the stuff on and off the boats? There's no sign of a port here. How did they get the boats in on this rocky shore to load the alum? I went back to Whitby to look for more clues. In the harbour, there's a half-size replica of the Endeavour, the ship from Whitby used by Captain Cook, the great 18th century explorer. I went on board to meet a historian from Hull University, Rosalind Barker, an expert on local shipping. What's the connection between Captain Cook's boat and the alum industry then?
It was this shape of hull, and particular strength of hull, because they had to be able to take the ground.
What's taking the ground?
Taking the ground is being able to sit ashore on solid ground while you're being unloaded.
So that would certainly be helpful to the alum industry because there are no ports around here.
That's right.
And it seems that Cook himself used one of these boats because he too was sailing to parts of the world where there weren't going to be any ports. So whether sailing to the South Seas or shipping alum from the remote locations along the North Yorkshire coast, the principle was the same. They came close to the shore and grounded safely. But what was it about the shape of these boats that allowed them to do that? Whatever it was had transformed Whitby's fortunes. In 1600, there were only 2 small boats owned in Whitby. By 1700, there were over 120, many of them relatively large ships, all carrying cargoes of alum. They could all take the ground, as they called it. To show how that was achieved, skipper Colin Jenkins found a sandy beach in Whitby Harbour and waited for the tide to drop. Well, here she has taken the ground.
Yes, she has indeed.
Wonderful phrase, though.
It is.
She looks very square in sections.
She is very square.
That's typical of this type.
Absolutely.
Taking the ground was common practice, thanks to the flat bottom. And it seems that the square shape had an important additional benefit.
They had to get as much on board as possible, but still allow easy movement through the sea.
One can imagine carts going up alongside her
yes.
now. It's very
easily.
accessible. Obviously
And,
very robust, so
yes,
you can pour cargoes of coal into the bottom and so on.
She was built to carry high bulk, low value cargoes.
A sandy beach was one thing. Grounding a boat of this size on a rocky foreshore was another. I headed back to Ravenscar and those tracks in the rocks to try to put the whole picture together. At low tide, it was plain to see that the foreshore was very far from flat. It wasn't where you want to ground a wooden sailing ship. The mystery of how it was achieved and how those marks and holes helped the ships to come in has been solved by archaeologist John Buglass. I'm still trying to imagine how they got boats in on this coast.
With difficulty, I think is probably the answer, but there's several ways you can do it. They'd have mooring posts set up on the foreshore, come in, tie up alongside, and as the tide drops, the boat would drop down and then sit on the ground onto the beach on an even keel, bring the material out and load it on over the side.
So the holes were for mooring posts, which also guided the boats into a safe stretch of flat rock where the hull wouldn't be damaged.
The other way of doing it is to have yourself a rock-cut dock, as we see here. It's a very fine example.
I mean, it's a very impressive structure, isn't it?
It is, mostly hand-dug. A lot of it would be manual labour, hammers, chisels, crowbars and things, but also black powder blasting to break the rocks up, and then they'd have to move them away to stop them being pushed back in by the tide.
So they clear out this base.
All this debris that's in here, this would all be taken away because any high points would damage the boats as they settle down onto the bottom.
Yeah. So the boats came in on the high tide and were beached at low tide. They would have had to race to unload and reload the vessel before the tide was back in again. It's easy to see why they built rutways to speed the journey across the rocks. Extensive system, isn't it?
Very extensive, yes.
So you have all these trackways converging down here.
They're all running down, they're all focusing down onto the low water mark, so they can load and unload the boats in the minimum amount of time in that one working window you've got.
They've just got to get it at low tide.
Just got to get low tide, and they've got to shift everything that's up there down to there.
When did they cut these?
17th century onwards, they develop as the industry develops itself.
As I put all this together, I began to see that for hundreds of years this now deserted foreshore would have been full of activity. There would have been horses coming down the inclined causeway laden with alum, carts crisscrossing the beach, and boats moored up, unloading coal and urine, and the alum being swiftly loaded to beat the incoming tide. And it's quite remarkable to see the remains of this massive industry all the way along this coast here, and now nothing. When did it all end?
It comes to an end sort of in the mid-19th century, 1850s onwards, when the technology has moved on to a point where they can now manufacture an equivalent of alum from coal waste and chemically as well.
And this extraordinary industry, this great length of coast, there's nothing here now.
The sea comes back, it's eroding the docks away, it's eroding the rutways, cliffs are coming down. It looks natural, but it's a ravaged landscape.
The rocks in these spectacular cliffs are full of fossils, including these beautiful ammonites, because they're vestiges of creatures that flourished for millions of years and now have vanished completely. Perhaps on a more human timescale, one might think of the alum industry, which certainly flourished here for over 250 years and dominated the coastline in North Yorkshire here. Now this mighty industry has vanished, just like the ammonites. But the post holes, the rutways, the switch points, the quarries, the transformed landscape are still here, the vestiges of Britain's first great chemical industry. For a free guide to the series and details of all other Open University programmes, call 0870 900 7788 or visit our website at open2.net. Next time, the mystery surrounding Glastonbury Tor.